We came out of the Mar-a-Lago summit with very high hopes.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
And I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Monday, October 8th, 2018. My name is Sam Seder. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Professor of African American Studies at the University of Emory, Carol Anderson, on one person, no vote. Also on the program today, UN's IPCC issues a dire warning about climate change. We have 12 years to avoid catastrophe. Also on the program today, Brett Kavanaugh seated. Welcome to our new Lochner era. Meanwhile, Susan Collins rationalizes and Dems organize, and Brazil goes to a runoff between a fascist Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro to face Haddad in 3 weeks. Officer Jason Van Dyke convicted of second-degree murder in the killing of Laquan McDonald. And if you are a voter in Georgia, it's time to Google Salon, Georgia vote purge to see if you are still registered. Got to do that very quickly. The Saudis reportedly kill a Washington Post columnist in their embassy in Istanbul because the new prince apparently very forward-leaning.
But also a little touchy.
And a touchy. Meanwhile, a Chinese national detained in China forced to resign as president of Interpol. All this and more on today's program, ladies and gentlemen. Just a programming note. Kids are off from school today. I am going to leave the fun half to Michael. The interview with Carol Anderson recorded the other day before Brett Kavanaugh was seated. It is a particularly relevant interview to give us to give everybody a sense of what we can anticipate, at least in the context of voting rights, but also to give you a historical perspective on where the court has been, and I think a good perspective on the way you should view history in the context of what we're seeing now with Brett Kavanaugh, because there have been in this country, obviously, more than two sort of irreconcilable, at least to this point, perspectives on how our democracy should work. There have been other perspectives, and two major ones, but which is not to say that there aren't, strongly a third or fourth, perhaps, one being more democratic and socialistic, and the other being more authoritarian and fascistic. But two major forces that have run through our history, and they really, in many respects, there's an ebb and flow to where they, how strong they are in terms of identifying with their core brand proposition, as it were. But they have never gone away. And I think when you hear the conversation I had with Carol Anderson about what voting rights were like following the Civil War and following really Reconstruction, and you're going to see some parallels between 150 years ago and today, 130 years ago, I guess. And we're also going to enter an era now with Kavanaugh where we're going to see some things that are parallel from the first 25 years of the 20th century. Really, I guess a 40-year period, maybe from 1890 to maybe 50 years to 37, which is known as the Lochner era. We have talked about it in this on this program at various times. You can go back and listen to some of the Ian Millhiser conversations we've had. But it was a period when the Supreme Court regularly struck down economic regulations. In addition to upholding a lot of laws that disenfranchised voters. So basically, attack the rights of minorities and of poor people and enhance the rights of corporations. That is the sort of 101 version of what the Lochner era is, and we are about to enter a new Lochner era. The only upside that I can say to this, and it's one of these things where I don't even want to say it's a silver lining around a cloud. Try and stay positive in these situations, but there is no calculation whatsoever where this isn't a massive net negative. Not to mention, Kavanaugh is a guy who I think is driven by the most hyper-partisan ideological find a result and then reverse engineer how you're going to argue to get there type of judge who's going in with a apparently quite a chip on his shoulder, not to mention a series of lies that he told to the committee. I mean, we just had the day after the vote, Chief Justice John Roberts received more than a dozen judicial misconduct complaints against Brett Kavanaugh, which a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals of the D.C. Circuit, because Merrick Garland, who is the Chief Justice of that court, I don't think that's what they call it, but the head judge of that court, recused himself for obvious reasons and handed over to Karen LaCraft Henderson. She dismissed some of the complaints against Kavanaugh as being frivolous. Others, she said, warranted serious consideration. They were based upon lies that he told during his hearings. So the guy is, best case scenario, a proven liar and an obvious liar. He obviously, and beyond that, people make their own assessment. Here is Susan Collins. Now, look, here's the deal. People were saying, why is Susan Collins getting so much grief about this vote, as opposed to, say, the other 50 people, mostly men, who voted for for Kavanaugh? Why not Joe Manchin? to start with. Joe Manchin's a Democrat, at least nominally. He's a horrible Democrat from a red state. Joe Manchin, if Susan Collins does not vote for Brett Kavanaugh, Joe Manchin also does not vote for Brett Kavanaugh. That is the reality. There would have been no space for him to do it. He would have never been the deciding vote. It's still not helpful to have him vote for Brett Kavanaugh. It's indicative of, in many respects, what a corrupt guy he is. But that's the reality of the situation. There's a reason why they timed it all the way they did. There's a reason why Manchin waited for Collins to announce before he announced, because he had to make sure that she was actually going to do what she said she was going to do when they were meeting all together. And they had a sense of where they were all meeting. And by all of them, I mean Flake and Murkowski and Manchin. That's why Manchin announced after Collins. Because that is how his vote was contingent upon her vote. And the reason why Susan Collins gets more grief than the rest of the Republicans who voted for Kavanaugh is because she has branded herself in a specific way as a protector of women's rights, even though she's a Republican. She has branded herself as a so-called moderate. And then she went on the floor of the Senate and basically argued just about everything you could without bringing up Pizzagate. She is not a moderate. She may be slightly less strident when she speaks, but that's not the point of being a moderate in the Senate. She votes with Trump consistently, and then she goes on CNN and tries to sell this garbage.
Do you still think it is possible that he did it? You just don't have the proof to back that up?
I do not believe that Brett Kavanaugh was her assailant. So I do believe that she was assaulted. I don't know by whom, and I'm not certain when, but I do not believe that he was the assailant.
And so people watching you, hearing you say that, you understand that they'll think that you're saying you don't believe her, that she, I know you say that she believes that he was, but maybe she was wrong. But if she said that under oath and he said that under oath, you made a decision that he said is more valid than what she said.
In this country, we have a presumption.
All right, pause it for a second. Okay, she doesn't want to answer that question because the answer is obvious. But also note that she can't just decide that Blasey Ford was accurate in the fact that something happened to her. She doesn't know who did it, though. She doesn't believe her about who did it. But what she's also not saying is that I also don't believe that she must have made up or imagined Mark Judge being there. And she must have made up or imagined the existence of PJ and her close friend who was there at the party. Like, how nuts does Susan Collins have to believe that Blasey Ford is to say this? I mean, it's one thing to say, I'm going to have a completely unreasonable standard in which to reject this guy's application for the highest court in the land for a lifetime appointment. It's one thing to say that. I'm going to have a standard that's actually even higher than it would be in a civil court. This isn't court. But it goes criminal standard, civil standard. If you were going to sue for for harm or something, I mean, there's a lawsuit that she could file. That standard is not beyond a reasonable doubt. And this isn't even a civil court proceeding. This isn't even a magistrate proceeding. This is a job interview. This is, we're going to sign off on you being hired for a lifetime appointment. But she makes up a standard and then pretends. This is how craven Susan Collins is. Continue.
We have a presumption of innocence. And as a matter of fairness, what I decided to use as a standard was the question of, is it more likely than not that Brett Kavanaugh assaulted Christine Ford? And there was no corroborating evidence that he did so. Each of the people...
Pause it. Well, but there was corroborating evidence, and everybody knows it. The fact that Blasey Ford had told her therapist 6 years ago, that Kavanaugh had done it was corroborating evidence. The fact that Kavanaugh was a blackout drunk, and there was plenty of corroborating evidence to the idea that he was lying about that.
Like you said, the calendar with the names.
And somehow Blasey Ford got it down to almost the week that he was at a party with those same people. But she doesn't have the ability to know who assaulted her. I mean, this is absurd. It's absurd. It's embarrassing that she actually goes on television to try and push this stuff. But Susan Collins made a decision the other day. And Lindsey Graham made this decision a couple of weeks ago. McCain is gone. They have lost the cover of there being some other sort of like third way in the Republican Party. And their future lies in basically becoming Louis Gohmert. Just a little bit, more polite. And now, I don't know how much they've raised now that will go to Susan Collins. It's over with $3.5 million now?
Yeah. They crashed the website within a half an hour of that.
But this is
indulgent, disgusting speech of hers.
This is why Susan Collins deserves to be hit on this. It's not like she just made the vote and walked away. She is trying to sell it. Her job, and she will get paid for it. She will get paid in support like we've never seen for Susan Collins from the Republican Party. Her job was to go out there and sell this to Republican women and muddy the waters and be the shill for the Republican Party. That's what her job is. It's Orrin Hatch's job to dismiss the women with a wave, and Chuck Grassley to say women are too busy to be on the Judiciary Committee. Did you not hear that?
Yeah.
We have it in the sound list? You should grab it. Play that later in the fun half. Chuck Grassley overheard saying the reason why there are no Republican women on the Judiciary Committee is it's too much work for them. So this is where we are. And you can... The importance of this midterm election is obviously huge. And there is still a path to the Senate. It is, very difficult, but we are a month away from the election. I use Heidi Heitkamp as just as an example. The people who are motivated to vote for Heidi Heitkamp by this process are going to be just as motivated on November 8th as they were yesterday. The people who were activated in defense of Brett Kavanaugh and against the feminazis who would in some way endanger a potentially great man's opportunity to become a great man. They will not be as motivated. And so it's It's not just enough to vote, but go out and knock on some doors, tell your friends to vote, vote early. Taking the Senate is pretty crucial at this point. It's going to be much harder because a lot of the reason why the House is much easier at this point is because those districts where there are basically Republican women in the suburbs who are probably going to stay home, those tend to be the swing districts. And so those are the low-hanging fruits. But when you have red states, I think there are 10 states where you have Democratic senators running, or 10 Democratic senators running in red states. Much harder. So go out, organize. And the next step is going to be to talk about reform of the Supreme Court. And people are also talking about reform of the Senate. That's long overdue. We should say the Senate originally, I hope people know, was not elected by the people in the state. It was elected by the state legislatures. They were chosen, essentially, right? I mean, there was an election, but I have a feeling it probably wasn't terribly contested for those first 100 years, more or less.
Do you think statehood would be a good first step as far as that goes?
For D.C. and Puerto Rico, without a doubt. It's absurd. It's absurd. But that is a step one in terms of reformation of the Senate. Getting rid of the Electoral College. More democratic reforms. But I also think that pushing for court packing, I've stated this before, in my opinion, term limits on the court will be more durable, but push for court packing by all means. Because if that is a legitimate threat on the table, then a term limit is much more likely. And there should also be, to that end, get a commitment from your representatives to hold hearings on Brett Kavanaugh, whether he lied. And certainly Brett Kavanaugh should want that, to clear his name, to get out from under this cloud, to show all of those Clintonites who ginned up all of these claims against him that he didn't lie. Go through the Manny Miranda stuff when he received stolen information 12 years ago. Go through the questions of his drinking. Go through the documents that the Bush administration has. We're going to see some of those. They're going to be FOIA'd soon. All of this should be revisited. There is no other path. There is no other path, folks. Because, we get a report today from the IPCC yesterday. There's only 12 years to keep warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which even half a degree will significantly worsen the risks of droughts, floods, extreme heat, poverty for hundreds of millions of people. I've said this, I haven't talked about it for a while, but James Lovelock, the guy who found the hole in the ozone layer, was asked 10 years ago, 12 years ago, what he thinks we should do about climate change. And he says, essentially, oh, yeah, take a time machine. It's a conversation we should have had 30 years ago. He predicted by the end of this century, the world's population would be 80% less than it is now. Go from 6 billion to 1 billion. Europe will be sub-Saharan by 2080. He walked it back after a couple of months when people were like, you can't say that, because people are going to give up. But, we have a problem in this country. I mean, obviously, we have a problem with China. They've got to dial back significantly if this is the case. We've got to dial back significantly. But China's certainly not going to do it if we don't do it. And here's the problem. You can argue, and I know very few people who listen to this program do, although there are some. You can argue that Clinton and the Democrats wouldn't have done anything differently. But the fact of the matter is, no matter how much we agitate Donald Trump and the Republican Party, who control all the levers of government right now, there is no way to get this country to do anything beyond maybe in California you can do stuff. There's no way to have a policy, a national policy that is going to rise to the occasion. We're going to have to, there's subsidiary, this may be the most important story of the day, but it is subsidiary in terms of the order in which it can be addressed. That's just the reality. 1 million people could march tomorrow in Washington about climate change. And Donald Trump will come out and say it's a hoax, and he will perceive it as helpful to his reelection. That is the problem. If Hillary Clinton was president, I don't care how neoliberal she is, 1 million people on the streets of Washington, D.C., all of whom voted for her, would make a difference. That's the reality of politics. Maybe on the day they both get elected, their intentions are equally the same. I don't believe that, but let's just stipulate that. But the reality of politics is, for us to now influence the policy of the American government in terms of climate change, we're going to have to make sure that we have more elected Democrats than Republicans. That's it. And then hope that Brett Kavanaugh does not start a jihad on that court with the other lunatics to basically invalidate every regulation that we could pass as a country to address climate change. So, I'm not saying voting is the only thing that you should do. But for the next 4 weeks, it's the most important thing you should be thinking about. And not just your vote, other people's votes. So, do a phone bank, walking around your neighborhood even. And when you get to that last house on the street, ask them to go walk around and walk the other direction. Very, very important. All right, we're going to take a break. Do this interview with Carol Anderson on her book, One Person, No Vote. Mike will be doing the fun half. See you in a minute. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program the professor of African American Studies at Emory University and author of the New York Times bestseller White Rage on her latest One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. Carol Anderson, welcome back to the program.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Sam.
I have to start off by telling you that, and my audience, that if they have not read White Rage, do everybody a favor and please do. It is really had an indelible mark on me and changed sort of my perspective on race in this country, on history on some level, and has influenced a lot of interviews I've done since then. I mean, I feel like we spoke just months ago, but I know it was a couple of years ago. And so I really appreciate that work. And then people should go and listen to the interview after they read your book. But
thank you. Thank you.
I want to talk about ultimately the relationship between what you wrote about in White Rage with what we're seeing in terms of this assault on the voting rights. I want to go through these voting rights. I think this audience is fairly well versed in these issues, but let's talk about the history of disenfranchisement that we've seen in this country and the way that it has, I guess, mutated, but also stayed the same.
Yeah. So, and that's historians are always fascinated by issues of continuity and change, and disfranchisement, voter suppression, really sums that up. I guess a great way to start is the 1890 Mississippi Plan, and that was seen as a progressive measure. It was defined as a way to end corruption at the ballot box, to make democracy pure. And that required the massive disfranchisement of black voters. But Mississippi couldn't say, we don't want black people to vote, because there was this thing called the 15th Amendment that said that the right to vote shall not be abridged on account of race. And so how do we say we don't want black people to vote and not get black people to vote? And what Mississippi did, and it was a plan then that other states modeled, was to develop a series of measures that looked at the societally imposed characteristics of a people, such as undereducation, so you're going to need a literacy test, such as poverty, so you're going to need a poll tax, and then created those kinds of devices that were so effective in staying on this side of the 15th Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court approved literacy tests, and the poll tax is not violating the 15th Amendment, while also getting to the point where those two things alone, as well as with election day terrorism, were powerful enough by the time that the U.S. was at war with the Nazis. 97% of African Americans in the South were not registered to vote.
Wow.
Yes.
And we should say, right, I mean, that is, and, forgive me for doing this, but what we're watching there is the response to Reconstruction, and the response in many respects to the 15th Amendment. It is, you're basically watching the white power structure attempt to roll back any gains that were made in terms of black voting.
Absolutely. And to do that in ways, and this is why, it's apocryphal, but they say Mark Twain, history may not repeat itself, but it sure do rhyme. This way of saying this is about protecting democracy while it is about entrenching the white power structure by stripping African Americans of one of their key citizenship rights, which therefore leaves them vulnerable to stripping of an array of other rights.
Okay, so and is this the first time we see this model? Because this is, I mean, like you say, it may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. This model of protecting democracy, so we will put restrictions on what it takes to vote. In one era, we may call it a poll tax. In another era, we may call it an ID that's issued from a DMV. Was this the first example of that? Was it the first time it was necessary? And are we talking about primarily southern states? How much was this an issue in northern states as well when we talk about, Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction?
Okay, so this was primarily, the 15th Amendment made this a necessity. Prior to this time, prior to the Civil War, when the U.S. was founded, the vote was not universal. White male property became the kind of litmus test, the eligibility requirements. And the struggle since that time has been to open up the vote, to make the democracy real, to make it vibrant. And the 15th Amendment was designed to do that. And then, boom, by 1890, this is when you see the rise of Jim Crow and the Mississippi Plan. The North did not have those kinds of restrictions. The North had other elements that it did. And so the North had the kinds of political machines where there was a patronage system. And so the North had a different kind of corruption going on. But this kind of systematic attack on the right to vote, that was a Southern phenomenon targeted at African Americans.
Okay, so when we see the essentially the blowback, right? I mean, it takes place. The 15th Amendment was passed, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was in 1870.
Yes.
And so
look at you.
it takes about 20 some odd years for the innovation, I guess, to take place on how they're going to roll back those protections, and then the Supreme Court blesses this form of voter suppression, which is, I mean, I could have been talking about the past 3 years, right, or the past 5 years, I guess.
Right.
I mean, we have watched this. I mean, just draw some parallels. I mean, I think this must be occurring to everybody who's listening because we've covered this, but the parallels are stunning.
The parallels are absolutely stunning because part of what the Supreme Court decisions require is that you don't pay attention to the evidence. And I know having judges not pay attention to evidence, it sounds like an oxymoron or something that doesn't happen, but it happens. So when the Supreme Court in the 1898 decision said that the poll tax and the literacy tests were actually valid because there were reasons for them to exist, and it didn't deal with race. That what the poll tax did was the states were saying that democracy was expensive and it takes a lot of money to hold these elections, to have people voting and then having people there at the polls and having people count the ballots and all that takes money. And what this does then, the poll tax, it shows the kind of investment that people are willing to make in democracy. And if people aren't willing to make that investment, then they really shouldn't be voting. The literacy test dealt with the so-called need to have people who were knowledgeable about the laws of the state and the laws of the land. And so it required reading a passage of either the U.S. Constitution or the state Constitution, and then interpreting it to the liking of the registrar.
Which is somewhat subjective, I guess. Right. Well, and all right, continue.
Yes.
I'm sorry, continue. And
yes.
Well,
and so then when we think about, for instance, the lie of voter fraud, because that's what we're dealing with now, just the way we were dealing with the lie of this kind of mass corruption that required the massive disfranchisement of black voters. The lie of voter fraud that really came to the fore in the wake of the 2000 election. That was that Bush-Gore election. And we've spent a lot of time on Florida because Florida was just such a hot mess with the hanging chads and all of that. But it was in Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, where the St. Louis Board of Elections had purged nearly 50,000 voters, primarily from Democratic districts, precincts, from the voter rolls, and didn't tell people that they had been purged from the voter rolls. So they show up to vote, and their names aren't listed on the sheet. Their names aren't listed on the rolls. And the poll workers can't get anybody downtown they can't even get through downtown to verify that these people are who they say they are. So they just send the people downtown. And hours are wasted downtown trying to get all of this fixed, trying to get all of this settled so that people can vote, which they had planned to do earlier in the day. So the Democratic Party then sued to keep the polls open for an additional 3 hours as compensation for the amount of time that people had to waste downtown when they shouldn't have had to do that anyway because their names shouldn't have been off the rolls. 45 minutes later, the Republicans came in and got a judge to overturn that decision and close the polls, and within 45 minutes. So the polls closed at 7:45, and there were so many people who never got to vote because they had been illegally purged and then illegally run around. Now, you could say, one of the things is you could say, wow, there was a purge and that really worked for us, but that's not what the Republicans said. Instead, Senator Kit Bond started talking about we've got to get these polls closed because this is a case of brazen, shocking voter fraud. You've got people who are repeatedly voting using addresses from vacant lots. We've got dogs on the rolls. We've got dead people on the rolls. They're trying to steal this election. And that language, that lie, what was an illegal purge by election officials, becomes the actual people themselves are committing voter fraud.
Right.
And yes, and an entire apparatus emerges around trying to rein in this rampant voter fraud, to where we get a Supreme Court decision coming out of Indiana, Marion County versus Crawford, where the Supreme Court acknowledged that Indiana passed a voter ID law in like 2005 or so, passed a voter ID law, and the ACLU and the NAACP sued. And the courts acknowledged, the U.S. Supreme Court acknowledged, there is no case of voter fraud in the history of Indiana. We can't find a case in the history of Indiana. Nobody's ever been charged in Indiana with this crime.
Well, it's also,
however,
we should be clear, too, that this is, voter fraud would be one of the silliest crimes to commit. I mean, honestly, because you would have to do this on a wide scale to implicate an election, at least a meaningful election. Like, I could see it happening in a small town. There's 50 people who live there, and maybe you think you can get away with it there, and you could actually affect the outcome of the election. But it's an absurd crime to try and commit.
It is an absolutely absurd crime. And think about what it says. It says that you have somebody who is going in to the polls using somebody else's identification, somebody else's persona, and repeatedly voting over and over and over. And the absurdity of that, is then verified by numerous studies. One of the largest ones was by a professor out of California, Justin Levitt. And he found that between 2000 and 2014, there had been 1 billion votes cast in a series of elections. Out of those 1 billion votes, there had been only 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud out of 31 billion. Wow. But that's not what we hear from the Chris Kobachs of this world out of Kansas. We hear rampant voter fraud. From Donald Trump, we hear rampant voter fraud.
Well, and we heard this. We heard this. I mean, this started. I mean, I don't know if it started. Obviously, it didn't. It started apparently in 1890. But we also heard it during the Bush administration. The very controversial firing of all the U.S. attorneys was a function of Karl Rove saying, find me cases of voter fraud. And too many of them came back and said, I'm sorry, I can't. I mean, I simply cannot do it. And they were fired. And that is when a lot of this started. But wait, let me go back still a little bit, because I don't think people fully understand just how long black folk were disenfranchised by things like a poll tax, et cetera. And I want to just even go back to the 15th Amendment for a moment, because how much of a conscious decision was the 15th Amendment to leave open the door for these alternate forms of voter suppression? And I ask for two reasons. One, all of this could have easily been addressed on some level by saying every citizen has a constitutional right to vote that cannot be abridged for any reason. Unless there's a compelling state interest or even like, it seems to me you could have written a one which wasn't so easy to maneuver around. And I also say that in the context of, this is very similar to the dynamic, let's say, with Social Security, where we're going to offer Social Security for everybody except for these 2 or 3 sectors like domestic help and farm help, which just happen to have the highest concentration of African American folk and maybe Latino folk and women. And that's just a coincidence. And when, of course, it was not a coincidence. I mean, how much of the 15th Amendment was that dynamic in play?
I think, let me back up to the 1867, because we're in Reconstruction, the 1867 Reconstruction Act, which is, 2 years after the war. And that act said that basically black men had the right to vote because women, period, did not have the right to vote. But it was saying that black men had the right to vote. And what the radical Republicans, and I know that sounds like such an odd term now, but that was the name of the powerful group within Congress. What the radical Republicans were afraid of is that as political winds shifted, that law would be easily overturned, would just be easily scrapped. And so they thought, let's do a constitutional amendment. Because one of the things that they were concerned about, and rightfully so, was that without the right to vote, the unrepentant white folks of the Confederacy would continue to try to reinscribe slavery by another name. They would do everything in their power to subjugate black folks. And as long as African Americans did not have the right to vote, then these politicians would not have to be responsive to the needs of that very large constituency. And so by creating the 15th Amendment, and so you've got this constitutional amendment that says that the right to vote shall not be abridged on account of race or prior conditions of servitude. That was supposed to handle it. It was supposed to handle it. But the ways of the U.S. Supreme Court that just did violence to the 14th and 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is the one about birthright citizenship and due process, equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment, the Supreme Court read those key Reconstruction amendments as something that they weren't, so that the 14th Amendment really isn't about individuals' rights, but it's about corporate rights. Corporations have the right, and that the 15th Amendment really wasn't about the right to vote. So watching these key amendments that were put in place to provide the protection, the kind of legal protection so that African Americans could enjoy their citizenship rights, be gutted by the highest court in the land and have the highest court in the land basically in league with unreconstructed rebels was what took us, frankly, with the kind of array that the Mississippi Plan entailed. So like the grandfather clause was in there. The grandfather clause said basically if your grandfather could not vote prior to the 1867 election, you can't vote. Well, 1867, and they didn't say election prior to 1867. Well, that was the Reconstruction Act of 1867. So whose grandfather couldn't vote before 1867? Right.
I mean, it's such a perfect, also exemplar of what is highly problematic with the Supreme Court, what has been problematic with the Supreme Court, what will be problematic with the Supreme Court, and then we'll jump up to modern day in the way that they have been dealing with any number of cases, whether it's the Texas redistricting, which stands out, whether it's Shelby. I mean, a bunch of these cases stand out as perfect that you could literally pick them up and drop them back into the reasoning of the poll tax. But, you know, the plain reading of the 15th Amendment is on account of race, right? Not by the use of race. But on account of race, which means that
on account of race,
you don't have to put the words "black people can't vote" for it to be on account of race. You simply have to actually make a calculation. What is the real aim by this? And you can measure that by who it impacts in a disparate manner.
Exactly. And it took the Supreme Court. So the grandfather clause came into being in 1890. It was not found unconstitutional until 1915.
And
so we had a generation.
And then we still had poll taxes, if I'm not mistaken, well into the middle of the 20th century.
Right. The poll tax was finally abolished in both federal and state elections. By 1966, I believe.
Wow.
So
I didn't realize it was that late. Wow.
Yeah, there's actually a constitutional amendment banning the poll tax. The literacy test was basically abolished with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we are in living memory of so many people. So, you know, we see the kind of cinematic images coming off of Selma and the Edmund Pettus Bridge in this battle to vote. And it is because of the stranglehold of disfranchisement. Had some counties in the South that had sizable minority populations having less than 1% of their black population registered to vote. Some, it was a percentage point of a percentage point. It was, in some, like Lowndes County, Alabama, had 0 African Americans registered to vote by the early 1960s. So this disfranchisement has been rolling through for 3 generations, and it has been lethal in terms of the kinds of policies that emerge. So, you know, you talked about Social Security. You can only have that kind of conversation if you have politicians from the South who are elected by less than, say, 10 to 15% of their adult population. Because there were times, like by the time we get to 1942 in the midterm election, where only 7% of age-eligible voters actually voted in the Deep South. 7% in a midterm election. When we get to the 1944 presidential election, it was 14%, whereas the national average was 62%. So when you only have to be responsive to a very narrowed band of your voting population.
Why was that band so narrow? I mean, in part because 95 some odd percent of black people can't vote. What constituted the other? Just abject poverty, or what was keeping the other people?
So poverty also played a key role, as did and they were very clear when they were drafting the Mississippi Plan of 1890 that they didn't want a lot of whites to vote either.
Right.
Yeah, you know, there's one Mississippi politician said, yeah, and this is going to get rid of the vicious white too. And it did. You saw the overall voter turnout rate begin to just plummet because the system is so rigged. And they had these little cutouts for some whites to be able to get through. But overall, it felt like the system was rigged, because that's what rigged systems do. They depress voter turnout. That's what stringent registration rules do. They depress voter turnout. And making it clear, there's a framing to the right to vote that treats the right to vote not as a right, but as a privilege.
Right.
A privilege that has to be earned by jumping through a whole series of hurdles and barreling through a number of obstacles. And so overall, what was going on in the Deep South is that you did not have a functioning democracy. You had a small ruling oligarchy that then, because of their seniority, because they kept getting reelected, because heck, they really didn't have.
They knew everybody who was voting for them practically at that point.
Right. Is that they then held the seniority positions of the various chairs in the U.S. Congress. So, they're on top of the Foreign Relations Committee. They're on top of the Judiciary Committee. And in those key spots, they're able to shape federal legislation. So watching Jim Crow being inserted into the Social Security Act during the height of the Great Depression is one example. This kind of systematic denial of the right to vote to American citizens in one region, it has enormous impact nationwide.
And so we follow the history, and we see the Voting Rights Act comes in. We see later amendments that close the door on these sort of, I guess, long-lived but fairly blunt instruments to suppress the vote. And it feels like then, if we track that to the late 60s, we have really 30 some odd years of a fairly consistent regime of protecting the rights to vote. We have the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which has preclearance for some 12 odd states in counties in 14 states, including New York had 2 counties, if I'm not mistaken, that were subject to preclearance, which meant that they could not change their voting rules without the DOJ signing off, because they had a history of being racially, of discriminating based on race in some fashion. And then, of course, there was also other provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which could push states into that category of needing preclearance, and other things that would allow the DOJ to go in and prove. And then we have these, you've described now, when the first, stringent voter ID laws creep up in the early aughts. It's as if when the Dixiecrats moved to the Republican Party, they said, okay, now we've got to change our strategy. It's no longer we are oligarchs that exclude all black people, essentially, and poor white people. We've got to now open up a couple of doors for white folk to come in, rebuild our base, and then we can go back to imposing stringent restrictions that hopefully will catch the right type of people we want to catch.
And what you're talking about is the Southern strategy that Lee Atwater defined so brilliantly. And Lee Atwater was Ronald Reagan's strategist. And what Lee Atwater said was, in 1954, you could say the N-word, and it wouldn't hurt you. But by 1968, which is, we've gone through the civil rights movement. By 1968, you can't say it. It hurts you. It backfires. And so the response then isn't, we need to really move on to a non-racial policy, a non-racist policy. Instead, what Lee Atwater says, and so what you start doing is you start talking about economic things, like cutting taxes or forced busing or states' rights. And the whole point of this he said, is that blacks get hurt worse than whites.
You may take some whites. You may hurt some whites as well, but the overall impetus is going to be, and certainly the perception is right. Like the idea is that when we think about welfare, we are trained to think that these are just handouts to black people.
Right. And that is, again, a key element of the Southern strategy. When you think about the way that Reagan talked about the welfare queen in Chicago, he didn't say the welfare queen in Paducah, Kentucky.
Right.
He said the welfare queen in Chicago. That is what we call a dog whistle. And so in that policy of now, how do we craft, because the key element in this, and as you talked about it, the wooing in of the Southern Democrats into the Republican Party began to push that party further and further ideologically and policy-wise to the right. So you start seeing virulent anti-immigrant policies coming up. You start seeing very stringent anti-civil rights policies emerging. Now, the problem is, besides those policies just being odious, is that the demographics in America are changing. America is becoming significantly more diverse. And as America becomes more demographically diverse, those Republican policies become more repugnant to a larger and larger share of the American electorate. So if you're a political party, you're looking up here and you're going, okay, so we've got two options. And the Republicans did talk about this. We've got a couple of options. We can either begin to reform and open up our party to begin to embrace. I mean, it's going to be hard for us to embrace black people, but how about embracing immigrants? How about doing that? And the response was no, absolutely, positively not, no. And so then the next one was door number two. Okay, so then how do we begin to shut down the demographics that we know overwhelmingly will not vote for us? And I think of Paul Weyrich, who was the head of ALEC and one of the founders of the Heritage Foundation. And he said in a speech, he said, I don't want everybody to vote, because frankly, our leverage goes up as the voting population goes down. And that becomes the blueprint. How do we keep more and more voters away from the polls? How do we discourage voters? And so you start seeing elements of that where they begin to learn that demographics are not destiny. And so we begin to see elements of that. And Obama's election really sent this policy into overdrive. Because what he did was he did not get the majority of white voters. No Democratic candidate since 1964 running for president has received the majority of white voters. But he got a sizable number. But his ground game brought 15 million new Americans to the polls. People had never voted before. And they were overwhelmingly black, Latino, Asian, poor, and young. That coalition was instrumental in Obama's victory in both 2008 and 2012. When you look at these voter suppression laws, they are targeted right at that coalition.
We have voter ID that affects African American folk and Latino folk, and in some states, what ID they'll accept will impact a lot of college students who may be in certain areas. I want to just touch on what cases, and I think people are familiar with the 2013, was it, when the Voting Rights Act was really, in many respects, gutted. And with the excuse, I think it was Scalia had said, well, the Senate reauthorized this, but they only did it because they were afraid of doing something that would be perceived as being racist. And they didn't mean to do it, or something to that effect. And I think Roberts called it, or maybe it was Alito, called it some type of a giveaway, essentially, to black folk. But what cases, one or two cases, sticks out for you as the most reminiscent of that Supreme Court that found poll taxes fine, that found literacy tests okay. Is there any case as of recently that sticks out for you?
That's a great question. I've got to say that when I talked about that Marion County v. Crawford case coming out of Indiana, that sticks out because there Justice John Paul Stevens has to admit that not only has there been no case of voter impersonation fraud in the history of Indiana, but that the cases that were talked about could not be addressed, would not have been stopped by voter ID. So I'm thinking, okay, so we are done here, right? There's no case of voter ID. There is no state interest in this thing, except in blocking poor people and black people. And the NAACP and ACLU had incredible data about the impact of this law on those voters. And the court just overlooked it and basically said they didn't believe it. It really wasn't, that evidence really wasn't evidence for all intents and purposes. But they believed the voter fraud lie, although the state could produce no evidence of voter fraud. That is what provided the constitutional basis for voter ID laws.
It really is stunning, and I think I would also tell people as we wrap up to look at the case in Texas, which is stunning in my estimation. This was a case where they gerrymandered. A court found that they had done it with racist intent, and they basically stretched it out. They needed an emergency. They needed emergency map for another election. The legislature adopted largely the map that was considered racist, but because they just adopted one that had been drawn earlier, they couldn't have had any racist intent. It was just expediency, and therefore they were deemed no longer racist. I mean, that to me was stunning.
Yes.
So what? I mean, what has to happen? I mean, because we are days away, maybe months, but who knows, away from having a court that is going to be very much like that court in 1890s, the ones that found the poll taxes okay. I mean, what do we do?
Okay, and so there's several things that we do. One is that we register to vote. It is absolutely imperative that we are there voting, and whom we're voting in, we're paying attention to that because we're voting in folks who believe in democracy, who believe that American citizens have the right to vote, and that it's a right, it is not a privilege. The second thing that we do is that we insist on when we have these gerrymandered districts, for instance, and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania have really,
right.
So I mean, and I don't, I'm trying to do the scholarly thing, but was the only word that came out, because Pennsylvania drew its map in such a way that the Republicans received 49% of the vote, but 72% of the congressional seats. And when that thing rebounds and eddies through, what has happened is that we have 16 to 26 additional unwarranted seats for Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives. And that's where we begin to see, and with these gerrymandered districts that protect these representatives from the will of the voters, we begin to see this massive disjuncture between the will of the people who want an Affordable Care Act and access to quality health insurance, who want DACA, who want legislation dealing with semi-automatic weapons, who want the children's health insurance program, who don't want a tax bill that transfers over $1 trillion to the uber wealthy. That disjuncture is the result of gerrymandering. So we need to insist, and there are ballot initiatives like in Michigan, to have nonpartisan redistricting commissions come to the fore. We also need to elect a Congress that believes in the Voting Rights Act so that we can get a reestablished Voting Rights Act put in place. Now, it's going to face a bucket load of judicial challenges. We know that. And so it's going to have to be written tightly, smartly, and we're going to have to continue to fight because this latest wave has put American democracy in peril. It really has, and that's not hyperbole. That is, when you look at the ways that the guardrails have come off this system, when you look at what we thought were laws that only turned out to be norms, that somebody who is conscienceless, does not care about norms, can just blow right through them. Well, you can see that the checks and balances aren't checking and they aren't balancing, but that they're in cahoots to recreate the kind of oligarchy that was happening in the Deep South. That's why we must vote. That's why we must put people in power who are very pro-democracy, and why we must also support the civil organizations such as the ACLU, NAACP, all of these grassroots organizations who are fighting voter suppression. We need to support them as well because they've been doing the heavy lifting when states have refused.
Carol Anderson, the book is One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. We will put a link over at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sam.
We are back. The indispensable Carol Anderson, White Rage, is a must-read for understanding our time. And One Person, No Vote, covering really important ground as well, obviously. We're a month away from elections. What happened in Brazil yesterday, I think, is another indicator of the importance of, yes, in conjunction with many other steps, but indeed voting, and voting in a non-perfectionistic or silly manner to avoid truly catastrophic outcomes, especially when those outcomes are very easily predictable, like extremely easy, like people of very, very, like it takes no extra insight to predict those outcomes.
In terms of things that take a couple hours, there's little politically impactful as voting.
There is, and in in some cases, less. There are a few things that might, as an example, you might spend literally months or years tweeting nonsense or, watching dumb videos. And you might, I voted a couple weeks ago for Jumaane Williams and Cynthia Nixon and Zephyr Teachout, and also a guy whose name I'm forgetting, but a good candidate who knocked out an IDC Democrat in our same district, Matt. And it took me literally, and I'm including the walk, a little bit of a walk to the polling place, 25 minutes. And now, it was very emotionally intense for me because Cynthia Nixon does not represent every single intricacy of all of my philosophical inclinations and policy portfolio. So I had a very emotional day dealing with that act. But then I did it, and it was extremely easy. It also just every time Carol Anderson and sort of not only historical perspective on voter discrimination, but the overt strategy of white supremacy through ICE policies, through rolling back voting rights. It's just something that can't be toyed with. And then conversely, people on the right get into power and they immediately go about assembling strategies to restrict power. And then we don't govern in a way that expands and entrenches power, which actually for the left means giving power to much more people.
The fun thing about us changing the electorate in a way that helps our side is expanding the vote and representation to more people.
Right. Our version of playing, of being ruthless, which is good. I won't say playing dirty, but being ruthless means people in Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. aren't disenfranchised anymore. Like, that's the kind of ruthless, or
that's left fascism.
Left authoritarianism is people in Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico are represented nationally and not taxed without representation. Left authoritarianism or left fascism or whatever, it means that we inject democratic accountability on the Supreme Court by introducing term limits and expanding seats. And even though the votes are not anywhere near there, having serious investigations for issues like conflicts of interest and potential past criminal behavior for at least two of these justices, Brett Kavanaugh, Clarence Thomas. So, buy the book, go out, get involved in these elections wherever you are and at every single level.
Zellner Myrie.
Zellner Myrie?
That was the guy who beat Jesse Hamilton.
Am I wrong or was it flipped? Was it
Jesse Hamilton?
Zellner was...
No, I know Jesse Hamilton was the bad guy, but was it Zellner Myrie or Myrie Zellner?
No, it was Zellner Myrie.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm just a dyslexic moment for me. I apologize. Yes, Jesse Hamilton was the IDC far-right Democrat, Republican. I mean, that's a good example. A left... I believe the district we're in Brooklyn has the highest concentration of DSA members. And this guy, Jesse Hamilton, had represented it for several terms, had been part of the IDC corrupt agreement, propping up the Republican majority, stalling left legislation, and, had just machine networks in low turnout primaries. And that's it. Until, a young actual left progressive candidate went at him and gave a choice, and we had to go out and vote for that choice and make that actually happen. And that will have a real tangible difference in terms of how things are done in this state.
There's a strong anti-incumbency factor out there that can be taken advantage of by socialists or non-socialists alike. So you want to get in there with the socialism.
Indeed. Okay, become a member of the Majority Report today, majority.fm/become a member. It's how this show happens. There's a link to it in the show notes if you're not a member yet. Pennies a day for a 5-day-a-week left, progressive, ecumenical left, broad perspective on news, culture, analysis, in-depth interviews, and, of course, a fun half. Become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show. It's a weekly deep dive into politics, sports, culture, trends, with a very global focus. And, of course, we have a lot of fun. We have a great, entertaining postgame. We have in-depth, illicit histories on everything from Africa, Canada, Brazil, political theorists. There's a lot going on there, plus Woke Bros, which I do at WAS. We had a great time. We did a sold-out show. I was a special guest for Count the Dings at the Bell House in Williamsburg on Friday. That was a lot of fun. Of course, you can get Jamie's not here with us today, but Antifada is her podcast that she does with Sean. And also, who's the third gentleman? Andy BK? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, I think.
They are coming at you as well. Check out the Antifada, patreon.com/theantifada. Matt.
Literary Hangover, we had a new episode. This one was a non-fiction version. We did Corey Robbins' The Reactionary Mind.
Very nice.
We talked about, MR members might like to hear our discussion of the zero-sum debate. Corey Robbins talks about that. So, and then broadly we talk about Robbins' thesis that what we're going through now is basically a late stage counter revolution against the New Deal and the sort of liberation movements that followed that.
Yep.
And the Republicans, where they're impotent, for instance, they were unable to slash certain Obamacare things. They're unable to, take care of slash all the entitlements the way Paul Ryan might too. And Corey Robin's suggestion is that's because they've already kind of won a lot of the victories that they've been fighting over the last 40 years. So, like, to take one example, schools are still as segregated or more segregated as they were than Reagan was in office, for instance, right? Right. So, and it's an interesting discussion. I think Corey Robin, I think we're going to have him on soon, aren't we? We got Robin coming up? I don't know. Anyway, we've had him on a couple of times at least. Yeah. I think the way he thinks about these things, it's actually one of the it's not super optimistic, but it's a important, I think, historical view of, the ongoing authoritarian menace globally.
Indeed. Corey Robin, essential read. We're going to go to the fun half. We'll see you there.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back, boys back, and the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you can imagine.
The alpha males are back, boys back, and the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Almost says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
I am a total cunt.
Can we bring back DJ Dannerky's song, please?
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Dannerky.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break for people.
That's fucking nonsense.
Hey, folks, reminder.
I do not have Parkinson's.
And the alpha males are
psych. Fuck them.
Almost says what? Almost says what?
Hell of a lot of bank. 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 Hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black. African. And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black.
See Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on! Fuck 'em. Fuck things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday! Happy birthday to me, Jew boy!
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are back. Africans are black.
Come on! Come on! Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
Welcome to the fun half, everybody. We're going to do our best. Really the only good news this weekend was the conviction of Officer... I can't, completely losing his name.
Jason Van Dyke
in the killing of Laquan McDonald. And I want to just say, I mean, I don't think, obviously sometimes you get you're wrong in this business in terms of like predictions, which isn't really that much of what we do. Thankfully,
I like to be judged based on my predictions.
You like to be judged based on your predictions?
Exclusively, yeah.
Well, I totally, obviously, I really did not call the Susan Collins thing correctly. And I mean, I don't like Susan Collins. I have no illusions about her politics. But it seemed to me that I was surprised. I mean, Sam covered this in the beginning, but I thought if she was going to vote the way she did, her tactic would be to, put her head down and vote. I did not expect a publicity tour and a grandstand for Brett Kavanaugh. That I did not. Nothing to do with her ethics or her politics. It just didn't seem in keeping with her brand. But it's another great lesson in the this is Trump's party, period. Full stop. All right, let's take a call. You're calling from an 845 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from? 845.
Hey, Michael. This is Michelangelo. I'm from Newburgh, New York.
Hey, Michael. How you doing? Michelangelo, how are you doing, man? What's on your mind?
I'm scared shitless, Michael. I'll be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
This IPCC report that came out this morning.
Yeah, we're gonna get to
I'm
it.
someone who I'd like to think follows, climate action, environmental science, ecology, declining global biomass, and to be honest with you, it's getting pretty scary.
Yep.
I don't think people realize what's coming, it's pretty terrifying. There's a real change coming, a reckoning. Feels like mankind is kind of sleepwalking into the apocalypse.
I don't disagree with you. I mean, yes,
CNN
you
gave
are
this
correct.
2.5 minutes. CNN gave this story 2.5 minutes, and it was done through a weather report.
It was done through a weather report. Okay, it's interesting. I guess I guess in a certain sense it is the weather. I mean, the only thing I'd say about this, I think that there's always the tension, particularly when you talk about something like climate, of what in social science they used to have this terminology. I don't know if it's still current in the field, but I remember, in college studying commons crises like 10, 12 years ago. And they would talk about basically crisis messages versus empowerment messages. And what they meant was they would do these simulations where there were these digital fish in a digital pond, and people would have a certain amount of fishing they could do or couldn't do, but it wasn't governed. It was all sort of left to personal discretion. Now, but I'll get to the second point in a minute. But basically what they would do is they would send messages to the group, either being like, we're running out of fish. This is being completely, people are reckless in their consumption. It needs to stop, or we're going to hit a wall and everybody's not going to have any fish anymore. The behavior was that they actually increased their rate, because their perception was, this is done anyways. I'm going to get mine. The other hand was obviously when they said, don't worry about it. Of course, it didn't affect people's behavior. But the messages that were like, this is dangerous, this is bad, but something can be done, as I recall, did have the most positive effect. Now, the problem with studies like that is that obviously something like climate change is not down to our personal behavior. I'm not saying that people shouldn't, make decisions to lower their carbon footprint and so on and so forth. That's very nice, and is going to be a little bit of the piece of the puzzle here. But obviously, in a macro sense, it's about policy, and fundamentally, it's about, in my view, not just capitalism. It's about capitalism. It's about industrialization. It's about rates of consumption.
Yep.
And it is also about technological innovation, because that is going to have to be a piece of the puzzle here, because the rate of the crisis we're in, and the fact that
accelerating.
Yeah, it's accelerating, and also demand for all sorts of goods is accelerating as well. And so we are going to have to think about, how do you green supply chains, and how do you, get more efficient vehicle fleets on the road. That's part of it. But, you know.
Well, I mean, the report itself even stipulates that, we're going to have to extract carbon out of the atmosphere at this point as a mandatory, policy proposal to address the issue globally.
Right.
You know, it's not even enough to just reverse and limit carbon emissions, but we now have to extract as well as part of the solution, which is just incredible.
Yep.
And I saw something today or yesterday as well, centered around Germany and their energy policy, that they actually, and I think Greenpeace was part of this, that they're facing a plateau of sorts because they were forced to shut down some of their nuclear power, and they don't have enough solar and wind to be able to sustain the their electric grid. And now they're they've kind of been forced to go back to coal and oil because nuclear is not seen as a positive, but maybe a necessity as part of this transition, just to limit
phased out
emissions.
nuclear. I'm extremely skeptical for obvious reasons of nuclear power, but I mean I don't.
Oh, absolutely.
But I hear what you're saying about. I mean, maybe that's not something to be dogmatic about. Although when you look at what even just storing it means from a basic safety perspective, the implications of it are horrifying and potentially like mass scale catastrophic in terms of hundreds of millions of deaths. So I'm very wary of it. And obviously I think part of what happened in Germany was that the phase out had started under the Schroeder-Fischer government of 98 to 2005, which is when, to that government's credit, they were absolutely in a third way tradition, but they certainly accelerated solar, wind, and they made a lot of improvements and upgrades to the energy infrastructure of Germany, and they did green policies to some significant extent. They were also phasing out nuclear, and Merkel stopped the process, if I recall, and then restarted it after what happened in Japan in 2011. So, yeah, I don't know the answer on that one. I'm extremely wary of it.
One last note.
Yeah, go ahead.
That I feel something that is worth talking about as well, given what's happening in Brazil, is that the global rise of fascism in the far right now is going to be antithetical to any real attempt at reversing our current trajectory, because the nationalism present within that ideology is going to be very limiting when we need to kind of coalesce as a global people to address the issue.
Well, yeah, because it's three. I mean, the one component is the bigotry and the nationalism, the xenophobia and the division and the formalization of, just the eliminationist perspective on most people's lives, frankly. That's combined with the fact that, when really given the choice, and in Brazil, the international financial press to some extent, like The Economist actually put out a serious anti-Bolsonaro editorial, but national, money and industry is lining up behind the fascists. So money breaks fascist, even if they don't think it's polite. And then the third component, which I'll emphasize, I think is definitely the least important. It is a byproduct, not a foundation, but there is a religious fanatic component of it. And when you start to look at whether it's Saudi Arabia or Brazil or the United States, that fusion of, maybe there are a lot of lives that will be lost, but as long as they're the right lives, people of color, so on, we can set up a gated community system. We can increase violence, which is what Bolsonaro campaigned on specifically, empowering police, empowering militaries to kill more people in favelas. The military dictatorship in Brazil didn't kill enough people, according to Bolsonaro. So, if you fuse that together with the corporate interests and a very a primitive, in a proper use of that word, expression of religion, I mean, that's a toxic cocktail. That's actually the cocktail that, with the destruction of the left in the Middle East, that's one of the reasons the Middle East has so many problems. I mean, really, it's like if you kind of have unbridled feudalistic capitalism and the only kind of public outlet that's available is a very narrow type of religion. There's no civil society, there's no labor unions, there isn't sort of vectors for that expression. And in some places, it's a more privileged experience than others, right? If you live in the Emirates or something and you're a citizen, you can have an incredibly nice lifestyle. Not a sustainable one, but a very nice lifestyle. And, but that's built on all sorts of exploitative feudal labor practices. So, yeah. I'm not cheering you up. Yeah. Thanks, man. I'm sorry. I don't have anything better to say. I'm sorry. All right. Thanks, man. All right. Let's get to this. This is a sound of Petteri Talas. I apologize in advance. He is Secretary General of what, though? He's not the Secretary General of the UN. That's Gutierrez. He's the Secretary General of the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, and he's presenting the conclusions of a new climate report at the UN. This is where we're at.
Climate change is already visible, and it's having impacts on human beings, ecosystems all around the world, and we can still limit the warming to 1.5 degrees. But we should change many things how we run our everyday business today. And one of the major issues is that there will be 420 million people less suffering because of climate change if we would be able to limit the warming to 1.5 degree level. And we have certain areas in the world which are extremely sensitive. It's the small island states, Mediterranean region, and also sub-Saharan Africa, which are already suffering and will suffer the most in the future. With 2 degrees, we would have ice-free summer in the Arctic every year, and once per decade, but with 1.5, we would see it only once per 100 years.
So that's the science, and that's the reality, give or take some variables that I'm sure are going to be, adjusted. We might even be in a worse shape than he's saying.
That's the thing about the Bret Stephens column. Like, who knows? They could be wrong. They could be wrong in either direction.
They could be wrong in either direction, and the likelihood of your less than 1% contrarian fantasy that this is no problem and there'll just be more prime beachfront real estate opening up in more places that like mangoes grow in your fantasy world, which has very little relationship to any established science on this, versus they could be soft pedaling how dangerous this is, it could break either way, and one way it could break fits with reality, and the other way it could break is just contrarian, nonsensical musings of a Bret Stephens. Now, the only other thread I think to add to this, besides that this is incredibly dangerous and incredibly serious, and that global ecology collapse, the global ecological crisis, as expressed through climate change, as expressed through rapid elimination of various species and plant life and biodiversity, should be, if not absolutely one of the organizing principles upon which we do politics globally, but really think about how we're designing our lives, from our food to our transportation system to even our sense of relationship to the world around us. I mean, some of this actually does get into some very genuinely existential questions about human experience. The other sort of dividing line is if you were to say that there were 3 poles of this right now, there is the fact that we are in profound, deep crisis, the fact that whether it's Donald Trump or Bolsonaro, or obviously all of the Republican Party, or most emergent fascist regimes are not serious. In fact, they might even be going in the other direction in terms of dealing with climate. Certainly in Trump's case, he is. Modi, it's a bit more complicated. He's actually rapidly deployed some sustainable energy technologies in India, but still nothing to overwhelm India's sort of carbon footprint. India's carbon footprint. So we have that one poll. Then we have, say, Jerry Brown exemplifying a technocratic, long-range approach to climate, which is obviously, again, in a world of relative choices, it's way better than Trump. It's way better that you have a governor of California forcing efficiency upgrades, having a different car fleet, having different energy standards. But at the same time, as Joshua Kahn, who's an associate of mine and a global climate activist, there's no justice in that Jerry Brown vision. That's why the issues of environmental racism in California have not been addressed at the same time as this sort of all of this rapid action on climate change. That's why there's still fracking permits being given, which disproportionately not only is bad for the environment, but disproportionately affects certain more vulnerable communities. So if you don't have a justice dimension and you don't have a dimension that deals with capital, you will have a fight between eliminationist fascists whose policy, the Trump administration recently, the EPA, I believe, put out a document banking on a 7-degree increase in temperature in 100 years from now. That is a built-in assumption of a radically scarred, dangerous, death-filled world. But I could also imagine that a lot of people see a lot of opportunity for gated communities, for private militias, for all sorts of business opportunities for the Blackwaters or whatever, or Z or whatever the hell it's called of the world, to monitor, police, to terrorize populations like environmental refugees. And we already see that. You can't reduce what's happened to Syria to one variable at all, but there is a climate dimension to what happened in Syria. And so the same, outbreak of xenophobia and racism targeted towards people of the Middle East going into Europe has a direct climate dimension. So there's fascist versus technocrat, and then there's also the justice dimension of actually dealing with ecology in a way that integrates with broad human concern. And we don't have much time. And obviously, and again, I'll emphasize again, in the relative world, the Jerry Brown versus Donald Trump, that's the type of thing where you go out and you do an intelligent vote and you don't have a fantasy life and you actually make a concrete decision to choose one option that's better than the other. But structurally and fundamentally, that choice is still going to leave it's not just going to leave tens of millions of people behind and harm tens of millions of people. It won't get the job done structurally. What's this tweet, man?
So it's just a tweet I saw on Twitter. Is it Gal Galach? I gotta laugh when people say especially rich countries aren't doing anything in the face of climate change. It simply isn't true. They've been busy fortifying themselves against the very victims of climate change that they created at the expense of their own development. And it's interesting, and it's the sort of thing we sort of touched on it earlier, but when we talk about expanding representation to people, it can't just be within the United States, right? Because even if we had a very healthy universal basic income, it would basically be at on the backs of the poorer nations, basically. Right. So we need to figure out a way to. I mean, it's such a huge project, right? But
it's a huge project. It is a time where there's no option but ambition. And anybody who says that they have a simple answer for any of this, I mean, I think there's simple values, there's modes of analysis that make sense, but I mean, it's enormously complicated in terms of how you actually do this. But at least you need to be real about what needs to be done. And I think you also need to be real about what your playing field is, right? Because I think there are some people who probably would say, look, if we can fortify a certain type of lifestyle and protect things in a certain way, in the same way that it's not a national scandal that Apple and our whole business is built on, let's take a micro example, illegally mined minerals from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which have continued to fuel one of the most horrific multi-party civil wars on the planet. I mean, that attitude of indifference can just be scaled, in that second technocratic climate model.
Makes me think things like rights just to basic water and sustenance. I've thought so often over the past couple months about how, I can't remember what the stat is, but doesn't Nestle own some ridiculous, god awful amount of our fresh water supply?
I don't know the stat, but they do. And
that needs to be ended immediately.
There was a serious controversy at the United Nations in 2011 or 10 about even just a symbolic public recognition as water as a human right. It eventually was passed because the United States and France didn't veto it, but it was a present vote because of literally, concerned about even just fucking bottled water companies. So yes, 100%. And now a lot of that has to do with reclaiming an idea of commons. That is a Marxist viewpoint, and it's also, it could be an anarchist viewpoint, it could be a liberal viewpoint. There has to be some understanding that there are massive swaths of human existence, many of them ecological, and also I'd argue a lot of them technological, that were not generated by markets, and they are the product of either shared human inheritance or shared human creativity, and they're getting eliminated and privatized and profited from in a purely predatory criminal manner.
Yeah. I haven't seen the movie, but Michael Burry, who's the guy in The Big Short, has been exclusively trading in water commodities since 2015. So if you want to have an idea of where things are moving,
he's the guy in the movie who sees, along with a handful of others, where the housing market is going. So he's seeing the same thing with fresh water supplies. And if you go, and again, like he says in the report, go back and read a book like Resource Wars, which came out, I think, during the Bush era. It's certainly at least 10 years old, by Michael Clare, who's a security studies professor at Hampshire College. There already was every single conflict you could look at in the world, including ones that people don't pay any attention to and don't care about and have no reference for. It's small arms, which are usually coming from the United States, maybe China, that fuel the literal mechanics of the conflict. And most of the arguments have to do with gold, minerals, timber, water. That's it. It's another, I won't get into some new atheist thing, but it's another example of how in the real world, and even if you don't understand that you're operating in the real world, that most events are driven by very basic stuff. It's not about ideas and this and that abstraction. It's who gets what, where, when, and how. And the ideas we should have are ideas and ethical commitments to people having, as Matt said, a good, just life where they can access and participate in the commons themselves and have their human needs met. And God forbid, maybe even actually have some access to, realizing themselves beyond survival. You're calling from a 914 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Ray. I'm from Westchester. How you guys doing today?
Hey, Ray, what's going on?
Not much. I called you guys before the New York elections trying to get everyone to vote for Cynthia.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't quite work out, but, I'm focusing on other things now. Specifically, I'd like to talk about the, I don't know if you guys have been following the UPS contract at all.
No, tell us about it.
Sure. So the Teamsters organized the UPS workers. I think the freight workers are trying to get a new deal, and there's another smaller party that's trying to get a new deal. And the head of the Teamsters, I guess the package division director, his name is Dennis Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to force a contract on the UPS workers where he's saying that 2/3 of the people need to vote, but only 54% of the workers turned out to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And they all voted no. The no votes won. But because 2/3 of the people didn't vote,
mm-hmm.
he's trying to force the contract on the UPS workers on it's basically an anti-communist rule from like the 50s or the 60s.
Right.
So I just wanted to let people know about what's going on. If there's anyone who watches who is a Teamster, I want to let you guys know that there is rank and file people who watch you guys.
Cool.
And please pay attention to that. And to call the International, please, and let them know that if you are a Teamster, that you will not pay your union dues to a union that forces a contract on its workers.
Definitely.
Thank you guys for your time. Have a great day, guys.
Thanks, Ray. Let me talk a little bit about this Brazilian election. Obviously been covering it for a while, and I will just start with the obvious point, and a point I will extend tomorrow on TMBS, that anti-corruption politics are not only not a sufficient way to understand the world, they're a handy tool for the far right. And also movements that were actually important and justified in, say, 2013, dealing with the rightward moves of the Workers' Party government under Dilma Rousseff, and later on moves towards austerity, moves involving the World Cup, the Olympics, things that were bad for the Workers' Party social base. They absolutely warranted pushback and protest, and the Workers' Party made mistakes by not having a mobilized base the whole time it was governing. And at the same time, when people allowed a free-floating, context-free corruption rhetoric to reign, it meant that it was used as a coup against Dilma. She literally was removed from office for accounting errors, okay? And then to imprison an incredibly popular, important leader, Lula da Silva, on the flimsiest of charges. That's it. I've said it a million times, but that is the reality. And the reason this matters is, obviously it matters that Lula is the most prominent political prisoner in the world today. Obviously it matters that the assassins of Marielle Franco, the city councilor who was gunned down with her driver 6 months ago by people connected to the military or paramilitary or police, and most certainly the drug trade, it matters. It matters that police and military already go into favelas and murder people of color and poor people in Brazil all the time. And it matters that Bolsonaro campaigned, Jair Bolsonaro campaigned on increasing that number, and said that Brazil's military dictatorship made a mistake in not killing enough people and not torturing enough people. And that one of his main policy aims is to unlock the restrictions on gun ownership, opening a huge new market for small arms manufacturers in the United States. And it matters that Steve Bannon was just photographed with the guy's son yesterday because he's over there advising them as part of literally a global fascist push. The first round looked terrible. Bolsonaro took about 45% of the vote. Fernando Haddad of the Workers' Party, the substitute for Lula, who would have won. Lula was always polling at above double-digit lead over Bolsonaro. And what's stunning to me is that you actually did have an example there of Lula's no leftist. Lula was a union social democrat who helped democratize, was a major leader in democratizing Brazil, and then as president lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty and was globally recognized. He actually is what all of these resistance types say they would want, which would be a genuine, democratically committed social democrat who would defeat a literal fascist menace. Haddad's a substitute candidate from the Workers' Party. He received 28% of the vote. Ciro Gomes got about 12%, is also a center-left candidate and will almost certainly back Haddad. Bolos, who received less than 1% of the vote, but every vote counts, was a great, has a new, part of a new socialist front. Very good candidate, very sincerely to the left. May have been the one that I would have voted for in the first round. Marina Silva, former environment minister, classic example of somebody drawing insane false equivalencies, using her personal grievances as a loser to Dilma Rousseff in the 2014 presidential election to draw false equivalencies about supposed corruption in the Workers' Party with the fascist threat of Jair Bolsonaro. So the only hope now for millions of people in Brazil, and of course millions of people mainly of color, poor, labor, they will go and they will destroy the labor base of Brazil. They will roll back rights for women, the LGBTQ community. They will target anybody on the periphery. They already do, and Bolsonaro campaigned explicitly on it, and is campaigning explicitly on it, is a broad-based anti-fascist front with whatever tiny remnants of the center-right that may go to Haddad. There might be some. Alckmin, who's the right-wing candidate, got about 4% of the vote, and some polls actually indicate that a fair amount of his supporters will go to Haddad. And then that everybody else gets together for the bigger picture to defeat a threat that's so serious that I have to say our old buddy John Oliver even acknowledged that literally anything is better than Bolsonaro. So, but there needs to be a bigger lesson here, too, about purity politics, about not justifying corruption, but understanding different types of corruption functioning in different ways. There's a difference of a party that delivers for working people and has a social base that still needs to fund itself in a corrupted funding system versus parties who literally exist purely to run patronage networks, which were the parties that actually went after Workers' Party. They have no social base. They have no purpose other than money funnels for themselves. And then you have a fascist who, along with, Drain the Swamp, was able to capitalize on a general social reactionary, undirected rage at the elites and the status quo, even as most of those elites have already begun to back him because, incidentally, the other side of all the fascism is privatization, austerity, and literally a University of Chicago economist who advised Pinochet. So if the Workers' Party was a proxy, and granted, Lula was no Obama, no Clinton, was the most successful modern president of our world. But they could learn in the center, you need to have a mobilized base, and you can never have a permanent armistice with the right and with oligarchy. You can never have a permanent peace with them. But then conversely, people who got into and still even tweet at me about the Workers' Party did this and they sold this out and corruption. Well, you were nitpicking small bore things. You were missing an attack that started with the removal of Dilma and the immediate implementation of austerity, a cabinet that went from the most diverse one in Brazil's history, led by a woman president, to one of all white men. And now a literal fascist riding a wave of far-right social authoritarianism and generalized anti-politics. I saw a clip on Al Jazeera of a young man who no doubt watches a lot of YouTube saying Bolsonaro is terrible, but he's the only one that might decentralize things enough to deal with corruption. And that is what happens when people don't think structurally about things. And you just take some word like corruption. You don't ask why, where, who, and how it connects to, say, a bigger structural corruption of an oligarchy that has existed in a country that ended slavery 70 years after we did. And a one that personally loathes a guy like Lula, even though they made more money under him, simply because he's smarter and more talented than they are, and he comes from the lower classes. So we'll keep covering it. Pray to God Brazil pulls together. A lot of horrible things will happen to Bolsonaro as president, not least of which Lula dying in prison, even more civilian casualties and police murders, and a new flooding of weapons from the United States.
Obviously, we're not defending corruption here, but there does seem to be two animuses that drive the sort of anti-corruption sentiment, which is One is the sort of the apolitical nature of it. People like to
Right.
get behind that because you
Right.
can get behind it. It's just people.
It's
aren't-
bad. Everybody
Yeah.
doesn't like something bad.
And then
you don't
there's
have to think
also-
about anything.
There's also the austere thing, right? Like somebody's getting rich off the government. Well, actually, most of the time people are getting rich, especially if you read the Trump story, right?
That's
they have
right.
some sort of relationship to government. Government should be made to spread that around as like equitably.
Exactly.
That's the point. Not that there shouldn't be anything there.
Well, exactly. And the point being that, like, and of course you have to draw lines, and of course there has to be, laws and institutions, but there's also a difference. I mean, I know that there's people who will tell me in a U.S. context, and I'll actually agree with them to some real degree, that like, oh, well, you criticize Obama and Clinton and this and that, but they need to function in a certain system. And that actually has some truth to it. Well, as does Lula and Dilma and the Workers' Party. And unlike other people on the center left, they managed to exist in a system while actually massively delivering for real people. So, corruption is... And if you wanted a left anti-corruption politics, then you'd have to take on the whole thing. Then you'd have to say, where they did make mistakes. Well, why didn't they take on the media monopolies? Why didn't they, deal with policing issues? I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, obviously, they didn't do those things. And the political context wasn't there for it. But that's the real big picture. Not like, ooh, somebody got a condo. It's like... You're worrying about somebody getting a condo, supposedly, and you're going to get destroyed politically. And you also let a whole right-wing media in the same way that, far more valid criticisms of her than Lula. And you can't even put Clinton and Lula in the same, they're not in the same bracket. But there was a similar dynamic, too, of like this big sprawling corruption case happens. It implicates everybody, except actually for Dilma, because they have to remove her for something that has really nothing to do with it. People say she was involved with it, but she's never been charged, not what she was removed for. And then all of these other parties and all of these other characters, literally people with indictments, but not going, towards any criminal process because they're still in the Congress, they all of a sudden make it a Workers' Party issue. Because the right uses things cynically and strategically. While, different parts of the left hem and haw and perfectionize. And we, to say the least, don't have time for that shit. In Brazil or anywhere else. Okay, let's get to, there was a piece that came out in New York Magazine that was actually a very worthwhile piece by a German, a historian of Hitler, a historian of fascism. I don't recall the gentleman's name. But it was one of the most sort of... I'm not usually persuaded by those pieces, but this was one of the most sober, real comparisons between where we're at now and where Germany was at then. And one of the lines he said was basically, and I'm radically paraphrasing here, but one of the things that made it smart was like, think about Mitch McConnell. When historians talk about, like, if this is the death of American democracy, Mitch McConnell's the gravedigger. This is one of the most disgusting, unethical, immoral, grotesque human beings to ever occupy public life in this country. And I know that that's saying a lot. It's not just the obvious things, like the unprecedented holding up of the Merrick Garland appointment, which there's just a pure raw act of corruption. It's a whole career dedicated to simply being a bagman for any corporate interest imaginable at the expense of any human being besides the ultra elite imaginable, not to mention his own highly questionable personal relationships. This is Mitch McConnell speaking with John Dickerson about election appointments, and Dickerson corrects him here because McConnell is lying.
Notion that the Senate is somehow broken over this is simply inaccurate.
But, Mr. Leader, those things have happened, but this is of a different order. And Democrats are pointing not only to the way this was handled, but in the history of partisanship on the Supreme Court, your decision to block Merrick Garland is something they see as having kicked off a new stage in the partisanship associated with Supreme Court nominees.
Yeah, they don't know much history. You have to go back to 1880 to find the last time a Senate controlled by a different party from the president confirmed a Supreme Court justice to a vacancy created in the middle of a presidential election. They also conveniently forgotten that Joe Biden said in 1992, when he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the Democrats control the Senate, Republican in the White House. If a vacancy occurred, they wouldn't fill it. They also conveniently forgot that Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid, 18 months before the end of Bush 43, said if a Supreme Court vacancy occurred, they wouldn't fill it.
But
Talk
Mr.
about
Leader,
hypocrisy.
Right. But, Mr. Leader, I don't think that's right. In 1956, Eisenhower nominated Brennan. The 84th Congress was a Democrat-controlled. And also on the Biden rule, Joe Biden was talking in the abstract. There was no nominee was blocked. And he said to not have the nomination come up before the election, but that it could come up after the election. And so what Democrats say when they hear you doing this is they say he's creating new rules to essentially do what he wants to do. And as you've written in your book, The Long Game, when you do that, it actually hurts democracy.
Yeah, well, that's not at all what happened, John. You're completely misconstruing what happened. What I gave you is the history of this. I know the history of this. I've spent a lot of time on this throughout my career. What I did was entirely consistent with what the history of the Senate's been in that situation going back to 1880.
Well, I think the 1956 example, and also in 1968, later in the election cycle, when a Democratic president put somebody forward, the Republican leader worked with him to get that person a hearing and get him towards the Supreme Court, which is not something that you did. A vote at the time.
Then there was a Democrat. Then there was a Democrat in the White House and a Democratic Senate.
But the Republican leader at the time tried to help the Democratic president.
John, you are not listening to me. The history is exactly as I told you.
Well, we have a disagreement about the history, but I greatly appreciate you being with us here today, Mr. Leader. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
And
Mitch McConnell's obviously that was beautiful. Mitch McConnell's not only breaking the Senate, he is the gravedigger of democracy. That's how we should refer to him from now on. And that is an important, I mean, all of the historical points are correct. And obviously they're important for embarrassing him. They don't mean anything to him because he's a corrupt liar. But in addition to that, yes, this Joe Biden talking point is so absurd to use a guy talking about an abstract. Joe Biden was literally doing a thought experiment. And even a thought experiment that does not cover the block of Garland. Because the block of Garland, according to the Biden thought experiment, would have ended actually right after Trump was elected president. In the Biden thought experiment, the election would have been over, and it would have been like, all right, well, in a couple of months, we could, of course, appoint our own guy, but now regular order needs to resume because the election's over, and we're going to give Merrick Garland a hearing, and President Obama is going to get his pick. So, and, this is another, I mean, look, there's echoes here, at least in terms of the kind of establishmentarian, centrist, democratic, institutional, whatever you want to call it. They can whine and talk about precedent all day. Mitch McConnell does this stuff because he can. And, it's one of the last vestiges of like the performance of democratic process that he still feels a need to lie about it with John Dickerson. But the bottom line reality is you do this because you can. And Chuck Schumer and everybody was like, well, what about the president? Doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. They show that every single day. And the Democrats aren't willing at some point to disrespect institutions to save them. And I don't know if that makes sense to people, but it's like if you have one side that will literally do anything and they never will get punished or held accountable for it. If the Democrats take the Senate back and these idiots start talking about reintroducing rules and civility, you need to be calling them every single day and say, I did not vote for this delusional nonsense. We need to save democracy in the long term.
I always think
not a year in and year out cycle in the Senate.
I always think of this, and maybe some Lincoln historians can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but when he suspended habeas corpus, he did that intentionally to prove the point of habeas corpus, the value of it, right?
Right.
Like he didn't just ignore it and pretend like he wasn't suspending it. You sort of reiterate the value of it by doing so. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. You can't. You get to like what the thing is actually supposed to achieve, not just the performance of it.
And people can be cynical about, the usefulness of John Dickerson going through that history, in terms of how big of an impact it could have been, or it would have. But totally, and I think just from, the public from a public dignity standpoint, people have the right to hear this laid out for them. And just because our media doesn't do it typically or reliably doesn't mean that we shouldn't applaud it when it does do it.
No, absolutely. It's very well done by John Dickerson. And it certainly made that scumbag upset, which is also good. And this sort of continues with the, tell them don't do anything physical, don't do anything illegal. But you see these people at dinner, you're an asshole.
Yeah, their dinner should be over.
You're a gravedigger of democracy. Fuck you.
I remember in like 2014 or 15, I saw Hovind and Heitkamp sitting on a plane to Bismarck. I was on the same flight.
Right.
And I would just love to be on a flight next to John Hovind.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you'd be getting some good video there.
Yeah, how you doing, John? Let's talk about how you're ruining this country and the planet. Do we have the Chuck Grassley thing? Sam seems to think that there's definitely audio of this.
I think we should save it for him if there's...
Yeah, if it exists.
Okay.
Which there doesn't seem to be
Sam might have
any
had one of his
indication that
dreams again.
It's audio!
He was like half awake and
Chuck Grassley.
had a Chuck Grassley dream.
Well, Chuck Grassley said something incredibly sexist, and if there's audio of it, we'll find it tomorrow. But we do have audio of Orrin Hatch being... I don't even know what is the adjective for this. This is just... I mean, actually, this is a distillation of everything that just happened. This is a group of women protesters, rightfully continuing... Heroes, rightfully continuing to press after this grotesque charade of Brett Kavanaugh getting pushed through the Senate and the fake FBI investigation and the fact that he doesn't have a judicial temperament and the fact that there's exceedingly credible allegations against him and the fact that he lied and lied and lied and the fact that he's a corporate bagman and the fact that there's actually complaints about his conduct in his court that have been forwarded to the Roberts Court and the fact that, of course, the Republican Party does not care. In fact, they love it, full stop. Here's Orrin Hatch, one of the great villains of our time, responding to some of the great heroes of our time.
Don't sleep with it. Why aren't you brave enough to talk to us and exchange it with us? Don't you wave your hand at me. I wave my hand at you. When you grow up, Robinson. When I grow up, how dare you talk to women that way? How dare you? That first, how dare you? How dare you? That's right. You just whistled us. You just whistled.
Ma'am, you gotta hold the door, ma'am. You're gonna get arrested.
You just arrested.
Senator, do you believe women?
He's such a fucking asshole. That guy's such a fucking asshole.
Like some big old asshole owl.
I mean, this is also just, not to be ageist here, but like, Jesus Christ.
We need age limits on
this.
this.
It's just like a fucking, it's like the meanest nursing home on earth.
Can you imagine
policy?
Being
the
born
most powerful asshole nursing home.
Born in like the 30s and still telling us
anything.
Unless,
look, by the same token, obviously Bernie's the best member of the Senate. He's in his 70s, so it's not an age thing, but there is just something so unreal about this disgusting old misogynist bastard who should just be, well, I was going to say playing golf. I would probably opt for prison, but you're calling from a 202 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Is this me?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, my name's Valencia. I live in D.C.
Hi.
And I just wanted to, going off the interview you did earlier with Carol,
okay,
talk about the lesson in racism and all this kind of stuff.
Okay.
It's always easy to look at it and just be afraid of history and terrified by all the terrible things we've done. You just want to look away. Mm-hmm. But the lesson is the shit's going to happen again, which is what we're all going through right now.
Definitely.
Like, the point is not to just learn it and be like, bad stuff happened. It's to look out for what's going on now. And also that point was cemented to me when I went to the that against the white supremacists, like the 4 people who showed up a while ago in DC, that rally. There was a Palestinian activist who spoke, and he talked about other activists he knew in his community in the United States who were being denaturalized as citizens. And he was saying it to say, if this is happening to us, it can happen to you. Like, that's the whole lesson in, like, Black people's experience in the United States is, like, it's convenient. Like, racism is awful and all these things, but the point of it is it's economically advantageous to the dominant group. It is about all the other terrible things that go along with it, but the whole point is that they do it for a effective reason, which is to, step on one group to lift the other one up.
Yep, absolutely. And if history doesn't repeat itself, it at least rhymes. Thanks for the call. Okay. This is not a palate cleanser, but this is, speaking of knowing history and the consequences of a neoliberal assault on, people actually like reading, studying things versus just being trained for tests so that politicians can run on stat increases and terrorize teachers. Here is, and also the fact that in order for a broader fascist project to succeed, people need to be stupid, and they need to be aggressively stupid. Dinesh D'Souza is one of the most aggressively stupid people in the world, and he's on one of the most aggressively stupid and effective propaganda networks on the planet. Here's Dinesh D'Souza speaking with the always correctly named Steve Doocy about the Constitution.
Well, first of all, I think she's confusing the Electoral College with the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause was about slavery, and it had to do with an argument between the North and the South over representation. Ironically, the North, which was the anti-slavery side, wanted blacks to count for 0 because they wanted to reduce the representative power of the slave states. The South wanted blacks to count for a full person. So the 3/5 clause, which is usually presented to show that the founders didn't consider blacks to be fully human, doesn't actually show that at all.
He needs to be like planted
Just
in a rocket
amazing.
and shot into space.
We want to consider you people.
We want you to be full human beings. Now, in this one very specific sense of it increases our share and you are still literally human chattel.
They want you to be 0. We want you to be 1. So we're going to be 3/5.
Yeah, that's right.
And
In
then we
practice,
can represent you in Congress.
Yeah, exactly. We want you to be counted as full so we can represent your interests as enslaved and bondage, murdered and raped and branded people in Congress.
No, you just leave that part to us. You don't worry about that.
You
We
don't
got
worry about all that
taken care of.
representation. Long ways from now, there's going to be some goddamn brownie fellow who's going to understand what was going on.
But now here in the Carolinas, you starting to outnumber us, and it'd look really nice if we could just use you in a population.
I love how it went from like the standard Republican lie is it was the Democrats. They opposed civil rights. It was the Democrats, and it was like right because they were the Dixiecrats, and then when LBJ flipped and they passed civil rights legislation, they left the Democratic Party and they became Republicans. So so it's like you're technically right, but utterly wrong. A great example, actually, of why like facts don't say anything really in and of themselves when you're talking about issues like this. Yes,
you need to situate them in a historical context.
Right, God forbid. So you situate them and then you realize like, right, so all of those guys became Republicans. Not only did they become Republicans, they run and set the template for a structurally white supremacy-based party. But now I like how we're going back. We're going from like the technically true but totally disingenuous to just like the, why does everybody give the Southern Founding Fathers any credit? They wanted full human. It was the fucking North, man. They were just like, hey, if yeah, that's just unbelievable. That's just like, yeah, it was like,
But it works to their advantage, right? Like,
Yes.
if all of these things are these sort of arcane historical debates that nobody can
That's
see
right.
through the end of, or if everybody
Yeah.
can have their multiple positions on, then we don't know if the world's really warming or not.
Right. And that's all it is.
And I'm sure Ducey's follow-up question was like, interesting point. Anyway, moving on.
Oh, so you're saying that? Yeah, it's just muddy the water. It's just so that your like fucking fascist idiot uncle can like throw that at you in a conversation to just sort of add to the general stupidity.
Well, yeah, if they're so racist, why they want blacks to be counted in representation?
I'm a little bit confused by the fact that the racist guys were the ones saying that the black guys were full human, but I guess that's just me. I don't know. Dinesh D'Souza went to Dartmouth. I don't know.
Dinesh D'Souza, I don't know. He doesn't look like an American, so why would he say that?
Yeah, why would he have
if
a
it wasn't
bias? Yeah. He's coming. He's just like, he's calling balls and strikes, man.
He's an Indian guy who went to Harvard.
Indian. Okay. Speaking of stupid people, you know, we might. Does Taylor Swift deserve an apology from you, Matt?
Yeah, I'll do a full apology on TMBS tomorrow night.
Okay, because while we are not huge fans of Taylor Swift here, there has been a lot of speculation about her falling.
I hate to step on you like that.
Go ahead.
Dinesh was Dartmouth.
Yeah, Dartmouth.
Yeah,
That's all right. I know he's at Dartmouth. That's fine. So that would be Bill. That's a Bill Clinton. Like, so where does that leave us? Matt Leck said Taylor Swift's music was an engine for the alt-right. Meanwhile,
I thought it might have been
she's on
crypto-fascist.
Instagram. She's on Instagram saying to vote in a certain way. And then he says, let's do the apology, but not now, later. The whole thing's a joke. Maybe if Lula wasn't a fucking corporatist. That was the best when somebody was like, it was like, look, yes, 100% Bernie Sanders all the way. Was the establishment behind Hillary? Absolutely. And were they unfair on debates? Absolutely. And literally everything else from like the rigged primary thing has essentially been debunked as far as I can tell. Other than like a cultural favoritism towards her because she's the establishment, no doubt. And a sort of general bullshit condescending media narrative towards him. But I saw one person said to me on one social platform, and they were like, it was like Lula, who's literally been imprisoned and gagged, and they're just like, yeah, just like the DNC did we wanted Bernie, the DNC did Bernie. It's like, that was one of those comments where I was like, yeah, we're not surviving as a species. It's the same thing with the DNC. They wouldn't let Bernie give any interviews. They put him in prison because of a fake scandal.
Like I've said, if you were scandalized by what was revealed in the DNC emails, then you had a much say naive view of politics than you should have going into that situation.
Indeed. Anyways, Taylor Swift, she released an endorsement of 2 Democratic candidates. I didn't know she's from Tennessee, I'm assuming. Phil Bredesen, who is a very far-right Democrat, but he is running against the utterly loathsome Marsha Blackburn. She is a standout, one of the worst people in one of the worst Congresses ever. And then I think also Jim Cooper, who I don't know as much about. But I'm assuming, look, this is not her announcement that she's some great political radical, but this is her announcement that I have basic human decency and basic concern about human well-being. And I don't know if are you getting the statement? Okay, so she wrote this Instagram statement, and she said, I'll just quote briefly from it. Taylor Swift. I'm writing this post about the upcoming midterms elections November 6th, in which I'll be voting in the state of Tennessee. In the past, I've been reluctant to voice my political opinions, but due to several events in my life and in the world in the past 2 years, I feel very differently about that now. I have and will always cast my vote based on which candidate will protect and fight for human rights. I believe we deserve human rights. I believe we all deserve in this country. I believe in the fight for LGBTQ rights, and that any form of discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender is wrong. I believe that systemic racism we see in this country towards people of color is terrifying, sickening, and prevalent. I cannot vote for someone who will not be fighting for the dignity of all Americans, no matter their skin color, gender, or who they love. Running for the Senate in the state of Tennessee is a woman named Marsha Blackburn. It's actually pretty strong. As much as I have said in the past, I'd like to continue voting for women in office, I cannot support Marsha Blackburn. Her voting in Congress appalls and terrifies me. This is very strong. She voted against equal pay for women. She voted against the Reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which attempts to protect women from domestic violence, stalking, and date rape. She believes businesses have a right to refuse service to gay couples. She also believes they should have no right to marry. These are not my Tennessee values. I'll be voting for Phil Bredesen and Jim Cooper for House of Representatives. Please educate yourselves on the candidates running in your state and vote based on those who most closely represent your values. Okay, so yeah, I mean this is a clear, as I say, it's a clear appeal to basic human decency. And who's going to get triggered by an appeal to basic human decency? Well, if you guessed a absolute lunkhead who Sam will be debating soon at Politicon, you guessed correctly. Here is Charlie Kirk. I just also want to say, I hope that one in good spirit joke does not get turned into a reason to cancel the debate with Sam. I do not want to hear the endless mishigas from Sam about that. So Charlie, sorry for the lunkhead comment. I'll let you speak for yourself. I'm sure you'll look way better than the comment I made about you.
This is what I used to love about Taylor Swift, is she stayed away from politics. It's all about music, all about, female empowerment. Look, she says the more I learn.
That literally was about female empowerment. She literally said, I have to speak out on these issues because this woman has also LGBTQ, but such an anti-woman voting record that I have to speak out. So within 10 seconds, he's already completely undermined the entire bullshit he's peddling for this whole ridiculous clip.
This is what I used to love about Taylor Swift, is she stayed away from politics.
Right.
It's all about music, all about, female empowerment. Look, she says, the more I learn about Marsha Blackburn's record in Congress, I can't support her. Well, maybe she should actually learn about her record in Congress. Being a co-sponsor of bills that stopped human trafficking, sponsoring bills that would stop the flow of drugs and opioids in the state of Tennessee, against domestic abuse, so on and so forth. It's rather evident and clear that I don't want to accuse her of this, but I don't think she was the only one that wrote that post on Instagram. She probably got some very bad information. And look, it is part of this narrative where celebrities that want to do good.
I think George Soros wrote it.
George Soros was like, let me in that Instagram account.
In the world, I'll give her the benefit of good intentions, are being told that people like Marsha Blackburn are horrible people, and nothing could be further from the truth. And the final thing is, she said, vote for Bredesen. Well, if you look at Bredesen's record when he was governor, huge allegations of covering up sexual misconduct in his administration when he was governor, reported by the Associated Press.
So the last thing about Bredesen I've never heard before, it's possible. I'd also add that Bredesen cut Medicaid. I'm not a fan of Bredesen. I would, in terms of how our elections work, I would vote for Bredesen in that state with less than no enthusiasm. He's a terrible candidate running against one of the absolute worst people in American politics, who not only voted in all the ways that Taylor Swift or whoever secretly wrote her post, very good way of appealing to her, Charlie, that was very non-condescending, correctly identified in terms of her broad-based prejudice vote. She's also a bagwoman for the healthcare industry, is one of the main fighters against human beings having health coverage in this country in any way, shape, and form, voting literally to make people die in the millions. And she's also a huge advocate and supporter of the student loan industry, along with voting, of course, for every other piece of Republican legislation, for wars, for environmental gutting, and every single other way to make America poorer, sicker, and dumber hellscape. She's a disgusting, grotesque, appalling, and terrifying person. And Taylor Swift owed an apology by super producer Matt Leck.
Look what you made me do.
Yeah, I thought she was a closet Pepe. I thought she was a crypto MAGA, and I'm glad that she's not.
I don't think so.
I think just culturally, this is a cleave. This is going to go right through the heart of a lot of Trump support in North Dakota, I can say. I think there's a lot of crossover there with the females that vote for Trump. And
you think she's just underlining like the real like departure point of like, hey, if you're any kind of even a remotely decent human being, you can't be a Republican.
Yeah, because I did not think this would happen, especially something worded like that.
Right. Appalls and terrifies me.
Yeah,
because that's strong stuff.
Like, who would have thought that her politics would be should be significant to the left of Kanye? What a brave new world.
That is really literally a brave. Like, if you said when they had that whole thing a couple years ago where he like interrupted her at the MTV Music Awards to say like Beyonce deserved it or something, and you were just like, hey, do you know that like in 3 or 4 years she's going to be speaking out against fascism? And Kanye's going to be like the most like prominent black advocate of fascism in the United States.
Yeah, if the question was black fascists for 500, it would be Kanye.
I mean, I think he would be a respectable guess.
He would be, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, who else?
Yeah.
I don't know who else I would name. At least, notably. You could do maybe some actual research.
Well, you can do. Well, who's that idiot on the sports guy? I always forget his name.
Jason Whitlock.
Jason Whitlock.
Yeah, Jason Whitlock for $100,000. Jason Whitlock, like Mr. Like, there isn't racism. I go from my sports studio. I go from the ESPN studios to my doorman who lets me in my apartment. What are you talking about?
I think he was on the Ben Shapiro show last week.
Oh, I bet he was.
Whitlock.
Jason Whitlock.
Well, he's been on Rubin. I know that.
He's been on who?
Dave Rubin.
God.
Oh, God, of course. Jason Whitlock. I have some incredibly stupid questions for you. You have a 402, calling from a 402 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Yeah, I'm Heath Graham, and I'm calling from Nebraska.
Hey, what's going on? What's on your mind?
Hey, I was going to ask you, I've been wanting to ask you, Sam and you guys, this question for a little while. Issue pendulums, like political pendulums, how an issue will be on one side and then it'll swing to the other for public support and whatnot?
Sure. You mean not totally. I don't know exactly what you mean.
All right, I can't remember who the guy was that came up with this philosopher, but
okay.
The prevailing thought is that every issue is kind of on a pendulum as to where in society it flows. If it's more left or if it's more right or if it's more authoritarian or more egalitarian.
Okay.
And what I was wondering, since you don't know what I'm talking about here, I guess.
No, I have a sense of it now, but okay. Go for it. Yeah.
All right. Well, what I was wondering is where do you guys see the Me Too movement in that pendulum model?
I don't. That's way too. I don't think it fits. There's so many variants.
Yeah, I think that's the problem with the model. Is I don't think it's so polar like that.
Yeah,
I think in certain areas,
right.
Me Too, like there's definitely like a hardening backlash, but I also think it's still doing a lot of political work.
Right.
So I don't know. I think it's too hard to say.
And within it, there's different. There's liberal versus socialist.
Yeah.
There's farcical versus restorative. I don't think. I mean, other than an incredibly simple division between people who take that seriously or don't, which is a very basic left-right divide. It seems to me. All right. Thanks for the call, man. Okay. Let's read some questions. Ryan, I live in Georgia and was not allowed to vote in a runoff in my district in July. They changed the laws to say if you moved within the 30 days of the election, you have to vote provincial. The only way to find out is when you show up and get your vote checked. Now, I received a letter in the mail saying I'm not registered and have to fill out these forms. The letter says that I must have been 8 weeks to be able to vote after my info has been verified. I checked the address, and it's a letter, and it's from the GOP Super PAC. These are the lengths they will go to disenfranchise voters here in Georgia and everywhere else. Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams, those races are so important. They're important on a number of levels. And of course, I understand, look, this gets annoying. They're not perfect. And in any scenario, people are going to need to be pressured. But in Florida, voter disenfranchisement headed into 2020, there's going to be a huge ramification as who's running the state house there. And at some point, we also have to beat back a structurally racist and strategically racist party who does this across the board. And they're not only doing it in Georgia, they're doing it everywhere.
Elections are like in musical chairs. When the music goes off, you just got to go get on the chair.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
And then worry about positioning later.
Right. Doe, I need to interview a former prison guard behind the discovery of 95 bodies from convict leasing in Sugar Land, Texas. Further excavations will reveal more. White city resistant to recognizing them with a memorial. After slavery ended, sugarcane plantations owner needed work done, made up flimsy excuses to incarcerate, to use for continuing slave labor. Activists keeping in media need more voices to make city accountable. Tom DeLay used to represent it. Today's Indigenous Peoples Days, those white men in charge seem hell-bent on doing the same thing to the rest of America as they have done to the Native Americans. Do you see?
Yeah, we should shout out Indigenous Peoples Day. One thing I'm reading Alan Taylor's American Colonies, and I didn't know, but one of the reasons Columbus was so confident that he could circumnavigate and maybe get to Asia was that he thought the world was about 25% smaller than it in fact is. So if he hadn't been wrong about that, they would have starved to death if there wasn't a massive continent there. So Columbus, not a genius.
Not a good guy. Last call of the day. You're calling from a 224 area code.
Hey, Michael.
Hey.
Am I on?
Yes, you're on. What's on your mind?
Hey, this is Evan, Chicago expat, living in Southern California right now.
Nice.
First of all, get those shofars ready because I just became a member. And I also just joined. There we go.
And you also...
Oh, and I also just joined my local union.
Oh,
sweet. I'm a grad student at the university.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Congratulations. It's a big day.
Yeah, so it's a public sector union, so Mike? I don't care. Janice can suck it.
Yes, you can.
But yeah, I wanted to ask you guys, specifically, so we're talking about fascism around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to get a sense of exactly how prevalent, like real actual political power fascism is in the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be doing an episode of my podcast on it, and I just want to give my listeners a good sense of how real this is. So I know we know Bolsonaro is a fascist, Le Pen, Wilders, Orban. Is there anybody else that I'm not mentioning?
I mean, I think it depends. I think if you use a broader kind of like right-wing authoritarian, I think you'd say Trump, you'd say Modi, you'd say Putin, you'd say Erdogan, you'd say Duterte. Is that what you said? Yeah, Duterte.
Yeah.
And you'd also say, I mean, certainly they're less, but I think there's strains within the Tory party, and certainly things like the Windrush policy, UKIP, and the British National Party are absolutely on that end of the spectrum. And, you know, and in a way, I mean, if you really want to get loose with it, maybe you shouldn't get this loose, but I actually think I think the Chinese government would start to fit those parameters, frankly, like in terms of like how they're actually governing. But by that more, tighter definition, I mean, certainly Bolsonaro, Duterte, Trump, Orban, Putin, Modi, Erdogan.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad you're hosting today because you're a perfect person to ask.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, man. Have a great day. All right, folks. A few more IMs. Let's see. Do you see the tragedy of the Obama administration maintaining Gitmo prison camp, forgiving and enabling Wall Street criminals, promoting Clinton as Secretary of State, extending Bush wars, starting new wars, not getting us a public option healthcare, and many other disappointments had consequences. Clinton was defeated in 2008. Political greed and miscalculation have consequences. Jay Cool. Hey, Michael, did you think Haddad has a chance in Brazil? Al Jazeera has an analyst this morning say he has to move to the center to have a new chance. He does, actually. In that dynamic, and the center literally means if you don't want Brazil to go back to a military dictatorship. Like literally that's what it means. It's a weird dynamic. I think the polling shows, and I have little to no doubt that Lula would comfortably win. But Haddad is not Lula. And the center left, the Lula vote is already there. The next round is definitely going to be predicated on some version of, do you want to protect the late 80s Constitution? And there's no contradiction there between talking about labor rights and austerity and so on and so forth. But that is going to have to be the way in which it's done. I don't think there's any other way in which it's done. Brazilian in Toronto, there's a video on Facebook of showing someone voting numerous times for Bolsonaro yesterday and using a gun to punch in the numbers. I feel like I'm ready for an alien abduction. Yeah, I'll check that out. I hear you. Solidarity, other good news. Some Proud Boys got their shit rocked in Providence over the weekend. Cops did their usual thing, though. Maui vegan. Easier way to fight climate change is to go vegan. It's more than just nice. Animal agriculture contributes more greenhouse gas than transportation sector. Please interview Cowspiracy producers.
We already did
interview
them. And I appreciate everybody who's a vegan, but this is not going to be addressed through individual actions.
Yeah, it's just never going to be addressed through individual actions. And even on that lane, like working and banding together to, try to ban forms of industrial agriculture because of all of the obvious horrific abuses of animals and how big a contribution it is to climate, but yes, it's just not, it ain't going to be done through personal practices. Not to say you shouldn't do it, but that's not happening. Gabe from Atlanta, the other issue with that study you cite when it comes to climate change is that regardless of how different messages affect behavior, the most pessimistic messaging might be in this case the most true. Well, sure, but I mean, I guess this is where I'm a postmodernist. Like when you're talking about actual conditions like that, you do have to modulate what, like, true, okay, but if true solidifies do nothing, that's not useful.
Yeah, and you want to make your action based on the quote unquote true most likely prediction?
Yeah, or
right?
do you want to make it on the most
there? Grounded
operative one? Like grounded in reality, but potentially operative to do things. Exactly. Mediocre white guy. Appreciate your channel destroying Jordan Peterson, who draws many socially awkward aspies like my brother, who in seeking life/dating advice. Vava. I watched John Oliver's The HBO show last night, and I feel the need to point out how wrong it is to ask Brazilians not to vote for Jair Bolsonaro. Voters don't go out and vote for no one or nothing. Voters go out and vote for someone or something. It's lazy to just say don't vote for Bolsonaro because he's bad instead of a better option is and does. There are dark forces manipulating Brazilian politics. Taking Lula da Silva out of the race is one of the main objectives. I hope the left can coalesce behind Fernando Haddad. There's no doubt. And I mean, look, I saw the Oliver segment, and in the I'm trying to have I mean, people got really freaked out and upset about criticizing John Oliver for his ridiculous comments on Latin America, which is just utterly bizarre to me, especially because, like, I don't put, John Oliver is obviously not one of these right-wing ghouls, and he's not Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson, but he did some really, really stupid commentaries about Mexico, as an example. So we talked about it. I don't know why that triggered people so much. But his Brazil segment wasn't as bad, but again, it's still just this free-floating, context-free corruption stuff. And then, yes, a double down on, he recognizes that, of course, Haddad's better than Bolsonaro. But if you've, already misframed the whole exercise as just corruption versus fascism versus actually flawed, not perfect, but genuine center-left social democracy that will protect the Constitution and reverse austerity versus fascism and mass murder, maybe that's a bit of a better way to actually think about it. Teacher BB must replace GDP metric with factors that include social and environmental. Must replace the price system with measuring the internalized environmental costs. Economics at the root of the problem. Chris Lapaco, hello, sir. I ran the Twin City Marathons yesterday and set a personal record of 3 hours and 53 minutes, 53 seconds. I wore a T-shirt that said abolish. I wore a T-shirt that said abolish ICE on the front. That should show them who's boss. That's awesome. Congratulations.
That's great. I really like that. If you do any public events like that to represent an issue like that, it's really good. Good job, Chris. Way to earn that media.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. All right, I'm going to do two more. Louis from Texas. Have you heard Rogan's new Netflix special? Have a good day, bro, and I'll see you again real soon. No.
I haven't. I've heard that there's some weird things are too complex for politics angles of it, but otherwise it's funny. I've heard Joe Rogan's actually a good stand-up. So
I've only ever actually enjoyed watching him host the show. I tried his stand-up. I wasn't into it. The psychedelic Quaker GOP wins in November. Would they immediately move to cut Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare? I don't know. Immediately, maybe they wait till after 2020. But I mean, they'll move. They'll definitely keep destroying what remains of Obamacare, and yeah, they'll put that on the docket. Okay. Let's see. The final IM of the day. TMBS is my jam. Michael, it's not the meanest nursing home. The U.S. Senate is the American House of Lords. Term and age limits, please. We're back tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bulb, but finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid, for the road that bends before it finally breaks you. I guess somehow I lost my drive between the 101 and the 5. Do you know